Good morning and a warm welcome to the first plenary session of Day 2 of Charcha 2021. It's a pleasure to have all of you join us this morning for the Accelerating India's Development session. We're joined by an eminent panel of speakers, Mr. Arun Maira, Mr. Vijay Mahajan, Mr. Ashish Dhawan, Ms. Lakshmi Puri. Thank you all for making the time to address us. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly introduce our moderator for the session, Jeanette Rodrigues. Jeanette Rodrigues is South Asia Managing Editor for Bloomberg News, helping oversee coverage from more than 40 journalists across. Prior to this, she has been the Mumbai bureau chief, covering India's largest companies, financial markets, and central banks. Jeanette holds a master's degree in international political economy from the London School of Economics and Political Science. She is also the winner of the 2017 Excellence in Explanatory Reporting Award from the Society of Publishers in Asia. Thank you, Jeanette. Over to you.
Thank you, Nabina. And looking forward to this excellent discussion. I hope a very engaging conversation. Good morning and a very warm welcome to our audience, also to our distinguished panelists who have all, in various capacities, served a country preparing to celebrate 75 years of independence. Yet, as we prepare for this milestone, we have to remember our fellow citizens who will celebrate in less than desirable circumstances. In fact, circumstances that aren't acceptable at all. 3 decades of economic liberalization have pulled 300 million Indians out of poverty, but by some measures, 200 million have slipped back due to the pandemic. Even before the coronavirus struck, India's per capita income was among the lowest when compared with our emerging market peers. To discuss what we can do to accelerate India's transition to a new stage of development, we have with us today Mr. Arun Maira, a thought leader with unique experience across India's public and private sectors, who really both have to work together if India has to move on. Mr. Maira was a member of India's Planning Commission from 2009 to 14 and has served as India Chairman of the Boston Consulting Group. Ms. Lakshmi Puri served as an Indian diplomat for 28 years and has won multiple awards, including the Eleanor Roosevelt Award for Human Rights. She's a former Assistant Secretary General at the United Nations and former Executive Director of UN Women, the pioneering global entity for promoting gender equality. Mr. Ashish Dhawan is a private equity investor and philanthropist who co-founded Chrysalis Capital. In 2012, he founded Central Square Foundation, a grant-making organization focused on transforming the quality of school education in India, a very, very important topic indeed, as you all recognize. And in 2014, he spearheaded the launch of India's first liberal arts university, Ashoka University. Finally, Mr. Vijay Mahajan founded Pradhan and the Basics Social Enterprise Group, which have both supported millions of poor households through microfinance and livelihood promotion services. Among his numerous achievements, he was selected among 60 outstanding social entrepreneurs at the World Economic Forum in 2003. And since 2013, Mr. Mahajan is the CEO of the Rajiv Gandhi Foundation and director of the Rajiv Gandhi Institute for Contemporary Studies in New Delhi. Thank you so much all for joining us this morning. I have some questions for each one of you, but first I want to turn it over to you for your opening remarks, starting with Mr. Maira. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jeanette, and it's such a pleasure to be with Vijay, Ashish, and Lakshmi here today, and you, to talk about accelerating India's development. The IPCC has struck code red this week and said that we cannot, as humanity, carry on the way we are. For the past 50 years, inequalities have been growing, and Thomas Piketty and others have been documenting with great detail the pace of increase of inequalities, which have accelerated in the last 20 years, and during the pandemic became even worse. And we've seen during the pandemic how, whereas the people who had wealth already made even more wealth and stock markets boomed, the people at the bottom really fell out. Technology has been a great boon in the last 30 years. It has been a great boon for efficiency, and it has also created innovations. However, the applications of technologies have aggravated inequalities. We can see this right now in the vaccine apartheid. across the world and even within countries. Those who can afford can get. In education too, during the pandemic, the benefit of technology has been shown, but those who could access it could get that benefit, and the majority of the children in our country could not. They suffered even further because things went online. So there are global problems of inequality, environmental degradation, and inequalities. And India, I would say, has suffered the most in the last 20 and more years, and certainly through the pandemic. SEDA, the Sustainable Economic Development Assessment Framework, had shown us when I was in the Planning Commission, but we sort of suppressed the information perhaps. This is an international framework, that India is the most water-stressed country in the world, and India's pattern of GDP growth is causing the greatest harm per unit of growth of GDP compared to every country, even perhaps a little worse than China. And in terms of employment elasticity, every unit of GDP growth in India generates less jobs than almost every other country in the world. And this we cannot afford, because we keep saying our youth are our future. They will provide the demographic dividend. They can't unless they can earn and save and work with dignity. So we need to change the paradigm of growth and development. Too long, and I'm saying this has been carrying on after liberalization in 1991 and even now, when economists say first we must get economic growth, then we can afford to invest in education, public health, and public services. But I think we have realized, hopefully, that without health and education for everybody, there will be no growth. And moreover, without health and education and a good environment, life is not worth living, even if there is GDP growth. And that's the lesson we have to recognize. That is a new paradigm of development in which growth plays a part, but it's not all about economic growth. We need a new framework very clearly. The economists have been saying since the global crisis in 2008 that we need a new normal. But I'm afraid they haven't been talking through the lens of a new normal all this time. We keep coming back, even during the pandemic, to say, when are we going to recover the growth rates that we have, which is measured in terms of GDP per quarter and so on? When are we changing our outlook into what we really want? What has to be grown to have holistic development and the well-being of people and the sustainability of our environment? Albert Einstein, by the way, I studied physics in college, did a master's, and he's one of my heroes in terms of the way he thinks. And Einstein said this is a lesson for policymakers, that if you keep carrying on with the same method that you have used and just press the accelerator on it, hoping to get a better result, when the situation requires a different paradigm, you're mad. That's what he said. He didn't use the word mad, but that's what he meant. And so here we are. We have to not press the accelerator on the same models and the same policy frameworks, but get a new framework. And I'm going to say three imperatives here. The first is, as we as managers know, you manage what you measure. We've got to get a new scorecard, a scorecard which is about human well-being and environmental regeneration and sustainability. What would be the 3 or 4 key metrics up there? And they will be in different domains. In the environment, they'll be about inequality and society and the dignity of everybody in the society, soft things, but they have to be the metrics that we're going to pursue to make India this Purna Swaraj country that we said in 1947, Mahatma Gandhi, that we will achieve that. It's 75 years. I'm sorry to say we are far, far away from the vision of Purna Swaraj, and we should have a new measurement framework and not GDP. We must change the method of management. We must change the method of management. Ever since the scientific enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries, science has got to learn more about less and less. Science itself is broken up into fragments, specializations, and every specialization knows more and more about less and less. How it's all put together? What is the view of the whole system? What is the role of all these different parts? we're losing the sense of that altogether. And this is why we are not able to integrate our economic activities with the environmental needs as well as the social conditions. We need a systems view of life, a systems view of development. These SDGs say this very well. They've got 17 goals. The first 16 of them cover the environment, and they cover the condition of society, and they cover the state of the economy. And like 16 specific things. However, the 17th goal says, and that is the key, that we need partnerships. Now, we have usually thought of the term partnerships as between stakeholders like civil society and the public sector and the private sector. Of course, they're necessary in each of those goals, whether it's education, the environment, each of the goals. But equally importantly, all the teams working on the goals must have a systems view of how they fit into improving the health of the whole system, the resilience of the whole system. So that's lesson number 2, systems thinking, and learn to think systems and situate yourself, your activity within the view of the system. In other words, think global. And now my third point is we must in terms of governance, learn to govern locally. Act local while we think global. Because all these complex forces of the environment and about the condition of society and the state of the economy are not uniform everywhere. They come together in particular ways. And so the state of the system must be understood locally everywhere by the local communities and stakeholders in that locality, in the district, in the state, in the country, and they must cooperate with each other to take the situation from where it is for them to their vision of this holistic development framework that I mentioned as my first point. So these are the 3 imperatives if we wish to accelerate India's development: a new vision of development and a new vision of how it will be brought about. More lateral cooperation amongst disciplines and amongst stakeholders, and much more local empowerment and systems thinking, systems working, and cooperative action within communities. Those are my thoughts, and I would be looking forward to the inputs of my 3 eminent co-panelists from whom I have been learning a lot and from whose thoughts, frankly, Lakshmi, I met you for the first time, but a brief discussion also brought up this whole thing. Yes, we have to think about cooperation and think about systems.
Mr. Maira, thank you very much. And thank you for so eloquently putting your views on systems and also how to the need to measure how we quantify success going ahead. I say that because a large part of our population is completely left out of these quantifiable measures. Women, for instance, their work is not quantified. Apart from population statistics, they don't even figure in a lot of these measures that India uses. I want to now turn to our next panelist, Ms. Lakshmi Puri, for her views. She specializes in the welfare of women. And Ms. Puri, please, over to you. Please share with us your insights on this very, very important.
Thank you very much, and very pleased to be with such a distinguished panel, all of whom are very important development actors in their different areas. And of course, wonderful to be moderated, Jeanette, by you, and I commend your achievements and the work you have done. Now, let me begin with my hero, Gloria Steinheim, the feminist guru's quotation that feminism is about making life more fair for women everywhere. It's not about a piece of the existing pie. There are too many of us for that. It's about baking a new pie. So the acceleration of India's transition to a new economy should be about baking just such a new pie in place of the old, which was inadequate in any case, as we have heard, and has shrunk much due to COVID-triggered once-in-a-century disaster. I hope it's once in a century. What is being aimed at is to recover, reconstruct, and build anew an Indian economy that is resilient, future shock-proof, fastest growing to keep its tryst with 5 trillion GDP by 2025, and is targeted to achieve the 17 SDGs, with SDG 5 on gender equality and women's empowerment as both enabler, and I want to emphasize that, enabler and force multiplier for the new economy. And I really want to emphasize the sustainability part, which also Mr. Maira highlighted as a key, growth with sustainability. As of now, 3/4 of working age women are not in formal employment. That means 35%, as you said, Jeanette, of Indian working age population is not participating in growth, and the work they do, the unpaid care and domestic work, is not counted. And most women are confined to unpaid care and domestic work and informal work and micro and small entrepreneurship. So changing that paradigm will indeed add to enhancing per capita productivity, income, welfare, social equity, and accelerate growth, and I might add jobs, quality jobs. So it has been estimated by McKinsey that India's gender equality, or one may call it power of parity dividend, could be nearly 800 billion by 2025. And SDG 5 is indispensable for fully realizing the potential of India's youth power and demographic dividend for the new economy in terms of maintaining declining fertility rates across all states, and to empower, educate, and skill young women as a vital source of high productivity human capital. Now, women and girls were differentially and they still are disproportionately affected by the economic shocks and the social disruption of the COVID-19 health calamity in India as elsewhere. Now, here in India, their access to healthcare, including sexual and reproductive health and rights, was impeded. Care burden and domestic violence both increased by 30%. Wage inequality worsened to 1/5 of men's income. Formal sector job losses, 47% losses for 80% losses for women, and formal sector jobs, 70% for women as against 7% for men. So there was a further feminization of poverty, worsening of education and digital divide. And this not only in India, it has happened around the world. So the new economy here must reverse and move past these setbacks and chalk new milestones of gender equality and economic empowerment. Now, whatever the government of India is planning and has been doing towards accelerating to a new economy, it must, in partnership with the private sector and civil society, continue and intensify its efforts to activate what I call the 7 energy chakras of gender responsive economic renaissance. The first chakra is addressing the shadow pandemic of inequality from an intersectional feminist perspective. Women's socioeconomic identities, religion, caste, age, class, multidimensional poverty, rural, urban, and migrant status and disability overlap and operate together, compounding gender discrimination. A slew of PM Modi's social protection packages address these, and they need to be really intensified. The Garib Kalyan Yojana, PMAY, Jan Dhan, One Ration Card, Poshan, Swachh Bharat, Manrega, Ujjwala, 10 girl child programs, etc. But also protecting and empowering them through legislation like Triple Talaq or anti-trafficking acts. All these are very important complementary measures that are required and flanking measures that are required. Social services, and this is where I want to talk about the jobs that Mr. Maira referred to. What are the job-rich areas? Social services and care services. You know, in UN Women, we used to talk about the care economy. If we can create, it has the potential to create 1 billion quality jobs if we organize it and establish systems, as was being mentioned. So it can be major area. These are major areas of the new economy and can both be a means to end and a means to and driven by women's empowerment. The second chakra is to ensure that apart from the national mission for empowerment of women and national policy for women, all aspects of A&B, Atmanirbhar Bharat and all the national missions and flagship programs, whether they are Digital India, Startup India, Skill India, Make in India, and economic reforms overall are gender responsive. That a critical mass of women, that is, 33%, are involved in policy making and implementation of both the systems, transversal programs, and those dedicated to women's empowerment. Similarly, center and state governments could incentivize and require private sector companies to take special measures for increased participation, leadership, training, recruitment, retention, and promotion of women and their empowerment in the companies, in the marketplace, and also in the community, in accordance with the women's empowerment principles, which are widely accepted. It must continue to support women's organizations from self-help groups, women's cooperatives, and professional and other groups. Now, the third chakra mobilizes the 21st century gender responsive education, training, and skilling systems that would enable women and girls to achieve SDG 4, affordability and accessibility, and quality education for all. The new education policy of India must close the persistent literacy, numeracy, primary, secondary, tertiary, higher education, and skills-related gender gaps, which persist. The NEP, the new education policy, must foster their multi-sectoral knowledge, skills, vocational training, STEM talent, creativity, lifelong learning, and employability, which are the objectives of the NEP. Skill India must strengthen its women-focused component. With 76% of women teachers in schools and 42% in higher education in India, women's agencies as gurus must be enhanced through job creation, skilling, and leadership for dynamic new educational paradigms that we are seeking to create. And sustained human capital formation by and of women is indispensable for the new economy. The fourth chakra must enable technological empowerment of women and girls to benefit from and contribute to an equitable new normal of accelerated fourth industrial revolution and digitization in the new economy of India. Women must be enabled to master frontier technologies, because again there is a gap, and that leapfrogging has to happen, or right from supply chain 4.0, ICT, AI, robotics, Internet of Things, to digital work, learning, payments, health and commerce, and leapfrog into securing the tech 4.0 new collar, green economy jobs, and tech jobs that are the future of work. And I've done some work on this whole concept of the future of work and how it is working out in India. The fifth chakra is to ensure that a revamped and much expanded healthcare and medical infrastructure and services and productive capacity with an increased, and I'm recommending that 3 to 5% of GDP investment in the health sector has to be gender responsive. It would ensure universal access to affordable, accessible, and quality healthcare for all women and girls, and provide unlimited job opportunities. Already it's a gender intensive, a women intensive sector in many ways. So that can really provide major harnessing of women power. Also, forging gender responsive disaster management, risk reduction, and humanitarian response is an essential part of the new economy resilience building. The sixth chakra awakens women's economic empowerment for and through gender mainstreaming, the renewal of rural and urban infrastructure that must and is being undertaken, agriculture, manufacturing, services, and the building of local, national, and global supply chains anew, as is being attempted, as well as in strategies for climate resilient green production and consumption. And these sectors and these efforts to renew these sectors must integrate, foster, value, and even privilege women's skills, labor, enterprise, and leadership in both formal and informal and sunrise sectors. Targeted and mainstream measures and scaled up transformative investments by governments and private sectors, including through gender responsive budgeting and procurement, skilling, and financing. These are key aspects. And the last, and this is about mindset change. It is not, it's the change that you need to bring about. When we talk about the new normal, there were so many changes that we brought about in ourselves, in the way we do work, in the way we react. We brought about so many changes, but one of the major changes that we need to learn from this pandemic and create a new normal on is to change the patriarchal, discriminatory notions of gender roles that must be thrown into the dustbin of history in this 75th year of India's independence. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Puri. Thank you for that very detailed lineup of what needs to be done. If you can pardon my simplistic framing of or rather encapsulating of what you said, any system that needs to be built needs to enfold women within that system. Now, as we say in India, prioritize women, yes, for the well-being of the family and the nation. As we say in India, Madam, paisa lagega. Our next two panelists bring in the use of capital, the way capital can be enfolded in the system in various ways. Without further ado, I want to turn it over to Mr. Mahajan. Mr. Mahajan, over.
Thank you, Jeanette. First of all, I want to acknowledge both my earlier speakers. Every time I hear Arun, I can't, stop remarking to myself how much I have internalized what he talks about, and I sort of the only reason I think I'm a worthy pupil of Arun's is because I then try and take many of his ideas into try and see how they can be put into practice in this institutional morass that we have created and inherited. But thank you once again, Arun. Every time I hear you, it's so wonderful and enlightening. And Lakshmi, it's really so wonderful to hear you articulate what is truly, I think, an important global political agenda. I think it's time we brought the gender issue from either an appendix or a must-mention cross-cutting theme to the central inequality that is holding us back. And now, Arun talked about the IPCC evidence, but in yesterday's Charcha, Isabella Guerrero, who was the vice president of the World Bank for some time, she mentioned that there's been a recent study of 197 countries, and there is clear statistical evidence that those countries which were led by women were the ones which suffered the least due to the pandemic. I haven't seen the study, I just heard Isabella yesterday. But if that evidence is staring us in the face, then in this world where we talk about evidence-based policy, here is a reason to at least rejig all our institutions, to ensure that there is not just participation of women, but leadership of women. I think it's time we moved away from this supplicant position to start asserting. And I'm saying this as a human being. It's for everybody's good. It's nothing to do with male or female. Let's just get the best leaders, and if the best leaders happen to be, female gender, that's fine. And they're also more nurturing, more green, more sharing and caring. So we need all those values to rejig the new world. Coming to the new economy and transition towards that, Jeanette. Sudha called me at 6 yesterday because the chief economic advisor, who was supposed to be the panelist, dropped out. So and it took me only 30 seconds to agree, simply because I had just finished working on this book. Sorry, it's appearing ulta, but it's called The State of India's Livelihoods 2020, but its subtitle is Sustainable Livelihoods for All, the Challenge of this Decade and a Trajectory for Achieving the Goal. So I'm not only talking about what was the status of India's livelihoods in 2020, but what would it be in 2030, and what would it take for us to get to a desirable 2030 rather than a horrible 2030. Now, first, let me just, since Arun talked about numbers and measurement, first let's get the numbers, and they're very sobering. On 1st January 2021, and one can be precise with thanks to CMIE data, you literally get daily unemployment rates now, with estimates, of course. We had a workforce of 471 million, and we had 47 million unemployed. So in other words, a labor force, that is those working plus those unemployed but available for work, of roughly 520 million, 52 crores. And using a number of projections, and by the way, through the organizers, I'll share the web link of this study, and there is detailed computations that I've done. The projected workforce in 2030 will be close to, the precise number is 593 million, or 59 crores, assuming a compounded average growth rate of labor force of 1.64%, which has been, based on a number of estimates. And therefore, we will need 121 new livelihoods in this decade. Half a year has already passed. That's roughly 12 crore new jobs in this decade. And if we don't get those, then you can imagine the social and economic consequences of that, apart from the environmental Armageddon that is waiting for us, thanks to what the IPCC has already predicted. So, how to handle this? Interestingly, there is a great solution awaiting us just round the corner. We must remember that a lot of India's unemployed and the ones who are coming into the labor force, or those who are underemployed, are there. At least three things we can say about them. One is that they are more than proportionately young and more than proportionately female. Second, there are 2/3 of them at least are in rural India. And thirdly, a vast majority, something like 80%, are basically unskilled apart from manual labor and traditional skills. So it's, when one says unskilled, it does not mean that they don't know how to survive, but those are traditional skills, those are not exchange skills. So if we take this into account, and if we, under any circumstances, know that nobody, not even the world's greatest managers, political leaders, technocrats, can convert crores of people into skilled workforce, and also change the demographics and the location. So we'll have to create jobs for where the people are, both in spatial terms as well as in their skill terms. And therefore, what are those jobs? Interestingly, those jobs are what I call green jobs. And these are jobs to basically regenerate India's natural resource bases. What is called Jal, Jangal, Zameen, water, forests, and land. Over the last 75 years, we have completely eroded the natural resource basis of India's productive economy. We have more than 60 million hectares of land which is wasteland. We have out of our 40 million hectares of irrigated land, about a quarter is waterlogged and saline, and another quarter is actually not irrigated. It's irrigated on paper, but it suffers from what's called the tail ender problem. We have a huge groundwater crisis. We have, of course, our forests, although overall forest cover, green cover is going up, but we have a lot of problems of forests in the central Indian region and also in the Himalayan region. And as far as Zameen is concerned, particularly the soil quality has got degraded so badly that even in Punjab, there is severe problems of both high chemical fertilization and micronutrient deficiencies simultaneously. So we need to reinvest in these resources. And again, in this document, I have detailed computations. By the way, there's a joke in my organization that I can't write a single page of a Word file without having a spreadsheet behind it. And that's true. That's the engineer in me, Arun. And, it's so there is a spreadsheet available for anyone to check. And of course, I'd be delighted if you find holes in it and give different assumptions. But the fact is that we need to get quantitative about it. And India needs to invest roughly 2% of its GDP, roughly 4.5 lakh crores every year for the next 5 to 6 years to restore our natural resource productivity. And if we do that, where are the jobs? Most of those jobs will be in rural India. Most of those jobs are relatively unskilled. At least they don't require going to college for 12 years. School and college for 16 years. And these are skills which can be learned and easily picked up by people. Whether it is earth moving, whether it is water conservation, whether it is tree planting, whether it is diversification in agriculture, whether it is new forms of livestock rearing, whether it is also new forms of green work such as recycling, renewable energy. And I increasingly include both health and education in green jobs because they virtually do not use too much of material resources, but they enhance human welfare. And my definition of green is not just something which uses chlorophyll, or photosynthesis. Green means something which is environmentally friendly and yet contributes to the enhancement of the GDP. So having said this, and since you said that, we will be talking about capital, I will leave it to Ashish to talk about the higher end of capital because, he's really worked a lot in that field. But in the lower end, which is where I work, the microfinance, we have to remember that despite 150 years of state intervention in our financial system, we have failed as a nation to bring the collective financial resources to the service of the masses. We even tried to nationalize banks. We have had priority sector lending for as long as we like. We've had targeted lending programs. We've tried everything. And at the end of it, all we get is either loan waivers or NPAs and lots of reluctant bankers. If you remember the IRDP program, which was the historical program for giving loans to poor people, integrated rural development program, bankers first named it "Inko rupya dena padega," and then after the loan waiver, "Itna rupya dubona padega," and that pretty much summarizes what the financial systems, formal financial systems contribution is. So we have to find an alternative way to deploy capital to the needs that the true Indian economy needs. So one is, of course, the natural resource thing that I said. Unfortunately, most natural resources are in the public sphere, so that will have to largely come from the government budget. But when you come to the rest of it, which is the microeconomy, the farms and the firms, the informal sector firms, then we need microfinance. And we need a new architecture which privileges not the upper end of the financial system, but the lower and the micro end of the financial system, so that we provide capital which is badly needed. I want to end by saying that, while there are some signs of recovery and people are talking of V-shaped growth again and all of that, but the fact is that it is severely K-shaped. Half the economy is going highly up, as you can see from the Sensex, so on, and the other half is going severely down. So if it is K-shaped, I suggest three Ks, like Lakshmi's seven chakras. I'm suggesting three Ks. And the first K is, of course, capital, spelled with a K, like Das Capital. uh, and there I'm saying that the K that is needed is in the lower end of the economy. I just touched about it on it earlier. The second K is knowledge. We need to, and Arun touched a lot on that, but basically we need to hold our universities, our uh, knowledge institutions accountable to serve the needs of humanity right now. You know, they need to be held accountable for what they are contributing to society. Otherwise, I can guarantee you that in 10 years' time, certain professions will be reviled, just as certain professions were reviled historically over a period of time. Prostitution and money lending being two examples, and I'm a Mahajan. But I'm telling you that the professions which are right now ruling, including the financial sector professions, the management profession, they will be reviled because they contributed not nothing to the good of society, but they actually damaged the prospects of society. And therefore, we need to turn knowledge into an instrument for improving this. The third K is actually, just to stay with the K, is karmic. To be active, to put it in practice. So action, it is A actually, but just so that we can stay with three Ks. So it's very important that the capital and the knowledge are combined to put in practice this growth that we need, which serves the youth and the women who are the largest number of the unemployed. And we need to do that in a manner which uses new technologies, digital and so forth, the green technologies, the renewable technologies. And we need to do it in a manner that is pervasive. That is, it covers everybody. We cannot afford to have exclusive growth anymore. It will lead to more and more islanding of the economy. It will lead to more and more gated communities. And eventually, those will get invaded. Remember Bastille? We are getting there. So, GDP for this decade should be green, digital, and pervasive. Thank you.
Mr. Mahajan, thank you. There's a joke in my newsroom that if we had 1 paisa for every time somebody in India spoke about a V-shaped recovery, all of us would be Mukesh Ambani, if not Jeff Bezos.
True.
I'm hearing two very clear statements from all of our speakers so far. One is that we cannot keep chugging along. We cannot believe that we are entitled to growth. We cannot depend on the loan melas. We need a new system of development. And also, that new system of development requires a new mindset, a new way of thinking, a new way of measuring and doing things. At this point, I want to turn to Mr. Ashish Dhawan.
Thank you, Jeanette. I actually can't hear you, but I assumed from reading your lips that it was my time to go next. It's a real honor to be on the panel with Arun and Lakshmi and Vijay, all of whom I respect immensely. I must say that I'm decidedly more optimistic than all of them. And I also believe that whilst we do need to take care of the planet, we do need to recognize that women hold up half the sky, and we do need to change a number of things. I do believe that the old paradigm of how countries have grown, how they have converged, still very much stands. We, of course, need to create the incentives to do it in a more sustainable, more inclusive manner. So let me start by saying I think the India of the last 30 years, whilst I agree with Arun, it has the growth has failed us on many counts in terms of not creating enough low-end jobs or maybe leading to greater inequity. India is still a better place thanks to 6% GDP growth in the last 3 decades than it was in the first 3 decades post-independence when it grew at 3% annually. And on a per capita basis, because population was growing at 2.5%, we had marginal per capita growth in that era. So I would much rather live in the India of the last 30 years. And I know that obviously all things are not equal. There are folks who have not seen much improvement in their lives. But in terms of a large number of people have been lifted out of poverty in these last 30 years. And so I think the first thing coming out of this pandemic is we need to recognize that there is an opportunity to build back better. But the most important task is to stay on this growth trajectory, high growth trajectory, whilst being sensitive to the things that were pointed out in terms of a more inclusive growth model and a more sustainable growth model. I think the conditions are right for India to be very successful, in the coming decades. The Western world is slowing down dramatically. And if you look at the demographics in Europe, they've turned the corner. And in the US also, the demographics have turned quite dramatically. And we know of other countries in East Asia as well, where they're going to be in decline. Populations will be in decline. Working age population will be in decline very soon. Places like Japan, it's already started. And so I think India still has a young population, and unlike most other parts of the world. And so our trajectory can look very different over the next 30 years. We also live in a world where interest rates are likely to be quite low for a long period of time, just given the demographics and given how broken debt levels are, leverages. There's going to be financial repression. Willy-nilly, the Europeans, the Americans, the Japanese are going to keep interest rates down. And I think India needs to take advantage of that, in the coming decades. China growth is slowing down, and China is being vilified across the world. And there's an opportunity, and for economic reasons, a number of low-end jobs will start leaving China, have already started leaving China. I know that India hasn't benefited to the same extent as Vietnam or Bangladesh or other places, but there's a great opportunity in front of us. So I think coming out of the pandemic, we need to commit ourselves to a much stronger pro-growth, pro-business environment, while being cognizant of all the issues that were pointed out. We need to recognize that this is our time in the sun, that we need to take our GDP from 1,000 per capita to 10,000 per capita over the next couple of decades. And at 10,000 per capita, hopefully in purchasing power parity terms, that's closer to 25,000 purchasing power parity terms. We would have lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, much like the Chinese have in the last 4 decades. And we can criticize the Chinese on a number of counts, but the facts are unambiguous. 800 million people have been lifted out of poverty. My own belief is that while we do great work in the not-for-profit sector, it's really economic growth that's going to lift hundreds of millions out of poverty. And so we need to go back to focusing on ensuring that, our infrastructure spend is much higher as a proportion of GDP, and it's targeted appropriately to where the binding constraints are greatest. We need to focus now on lower-end, low-skilled jobs, particularly in manufacturing, but also in services. I don't think we should give up on the hope of exports as China evacuates many of those sectors. We must stay committed, and I'm not sure how the PLI will work out. I'm glad that the government actually is trying this out, and I hope that state governments and more of these incentives will be created. And we must recognize that SMEs play an important role. And I think as more credit starts to go into the SME sector, as more data is available, I hope that engine of growth starts to fire as well. Women, of course, a huge untapped opportunity, as Lakshmi pointed out. And if more women can be inducted into the workforce in these next 2 or 3 decades, as we look to build back better, not only do we create a more inclusive economy and society, but also it'll be a huge fillip for growth. Because India is at abysmally low levels in terms of female participation in the workforce. And I think in terms of the environmental factors, whilst we have our own constraints, having such a large percentage, 16% of the world's population on 2% of the world's land, it's a huge challenge. I do think, as far as climate change is concerned, India will benefit from global technology, some of our regulation, hopefully, and some of the incentives that the world will put on us will push us in that direction faster. As scary as the IPCC report is, I think the world has also worked out. And even pre-Glasgow, we've seen significant commitments from the major powers across the world. And many countries have stepped forward to make explicit not just 2050 commitments, but 2030 commitments as well. I think we need to also look at the development sector going forward differently. Firstly, to recognize that the state is a very big player in development, in education, in health, all these key sectors. That we spend almost 20 lakh crore on these social sectors, 15 plus lakh crore on these social sectors. And the role of government needs to be rethought. Mostly, state government is responsible for the spending. And I think we need, in the next couple of decades, a much stronger focus on KPIs, on outcomes, on getting better data, and really pushing to ensure that we're not just spending money, but we're actually achieving outcomes. And I don't see in state governments today this focus on outcomes orientation. We need to push state governments in this direction. I think the center needs to play a role, because in the development sector, the center's role from a financing is smaller. The money goes to states, and states really spend the money. I think the center needs to create more incentives to get states to compete, to make more performance-based grants funding available. And I understand that some of it has to be to ensure equity issues are met. Lower per capita income states get more money on a disproportionate basis for them to catch up. But having said that, I think the center needs to create the right incentives and have the right monitoring and evaluation framework, and have a real commitment to looking at evidence and prioritizing the right areas in the development sector. And we haven't done this, quite honestly, in the last many decades. And there's the opportunity to do this differently going forward. If I look at the philanthropic sector, the NGO sector, I think philanthropy will increase quite dramatically in the next couple of decades, as wealth has been crystallized more recently in the past couple of decades. But I think we need a philanthropic model that recognizes that philanthropy is a drop in the bucket compared to what government spends. All of CSR is 1% of what government spends on the social sector. And so I think the role needs to be to focus more on R&D, on innovative models, but also on figuring out how that translation takes place. I think there are so many good models in the not-for-profit sector and the civil society sector, but that translation into the state actually adopting those models. Education is a sector that works. So many non-profits have done great work, yet that never gets imbibed by the state sector. And finding ways to translate that, whether it's through project management units, technical expertise, getting NGOs to work in a more concerted effort on state-led programs, I think that is the order of the day. As opposed to just NGOs scaling, we need NGOs to work more collaboratively in ensuring that their programs are adopted by the state and taken to scale by the state. I do think we need to look at markets in some of these sectors, because in India, willy-nilly, the genie is out of the bottle. Whether it's healthcare or education, large portions of these are in the private sector. And whilst we may wish for a larger proportion to be in the public sector, the data suggests that, or the trends suggest that privatization is likely to increase going forward, unless the state pulls off a miracle. And so education is already at almost 50%. 50% of children go to private aided and unaided schools. It's likely to increase going forward. And I think we need now to pay more attention to the regulation, what is the right accountability, transparency, and yet autonomy that we provide to these actors in the private sector. We have to hold them accountable. We haven't done so in the past. And that's the only way we'll increase outcomes across a large percentage of whether it's education or health, because the private sector does play an important role in these areas. And finally, I think in these next couple of decades, if we get our act together, there really is the opportunity for India to craft its own development model and to be a leader in the global south. I'm not sure that the Chinese model, even though there's a lot to learn from it for the rest of the world, I'm not sure if the rest of the world can do a copy paste of that model. I think India is very well positioned to lead the global south, but we need to get our house in order. But I do think we need to build more bridges with the global south. We need to learn from good models across the global south, and we need to transmit our own models within the global south. So I'll just close by saying that I'm possibly more optimistic. I do think India will do very well going forward, coming out of the pandemic, as difficult as it's been. And I think we're very well positioned amongst the best positioned economies globally to do well. And it really depends on us to get our house in order to achieve this potential in the next 2 or 3 decades, whilst ensuring we don't blow up the planet, and whilst ensuring that this growth is inclusive, and it really does impact the bottom half of the pyramid this time around.
Mr. Dhawan, apologies, I'm not sure you can hear me still, but thank you for situating India within the global world, within the changes in the global world, especially with the global backlash against China and how India could possibly benefit there, the decline of the West, or rather, the way I would put it is a saturation of Western markets, which opens up room for India and other emerging markets. Having said that, as all the panelists here rightly said, India is still abysmally low on per capita income compared to the Western audiences. I would love to ask, there are lots of questions coming in from the audience, but we're running out of time, unfortunately. So I want to ask the other panelists, I'm not sure Mr. Dhawan can hear me, but if we could ask the other panelists one quick question. Yes, the world is changing. Yes, global capital is looking to come into India. Yes, India is well positioned. But India is also a young country. As Ms. Puri said, the fertility rate is coming down for a large number of states. Will India become rich before Indians become old? If I could ask each of the panelists the answer in yes or no, and if they could give one action point to get there. If I could start with Mr. Maira.
The answer has to be conditional. India will become rich before it gets old if we change the approach that we are taking and the ideas that we are following for our development now on. The ideas that we've used so far, they are Western ideas, imported ideas. They come along with Western capital. And as Ashish said, we have to have a new development model, an Indian development model situated in our own best capabilities, resources, our youth, our women, so that they, like Lakshmi said, they bake a new pie. They are the bakers of the pie. They're not people who are going to wait for a slice of the pie after capital has made a bigger growth pie for them. So we need a new model, and I can see senses, and certainly in what Vijay said and Lakshmi said, and Ashish also teasing us to say we need a new model. And since people are talking about a new model, and I can hear the contours of this new model in the conversation today, therefore I have hope. But if we slip back into the old way of saying, unless just the GDP grows, India cannot grow, I have no hope.
Ms. Puri.
So I think we can. Certainly. I always believe in yes, we can. But we can do it if we can do two things. As was mentioned, we can get all the key enablers of sustainable development in place that were mentioned in this very rich dialogue. But very importantly, how can we empower young women? I think that's the key, because you're talking about before we get old and we have to accelerate economic development and growth through the empowerment of young women, which means no child marriage, or at least reduce child marriage, late marriage for young women, education, work participation in the labor force, all of that will change the whole dynamics of our being able to really utilize the demographic dividend, to exploit the demographic dividend. So young women empowerment is the key.
Thank you, Ms. Puri. Mr. Mahajan.
Well, as Ashish said, we need to be optimistic, but I think I agree with Arun that we can't be optimistic blindly, and certainly not by continuing business as usual. We need massive changes in our paradigm. One of the big changes we need is the exceptionally overwhelming role we've given to the state in India. Starting with our constitution, we've made the state responsible for welfare, for development, for everything. And I think it's time we as citizens on the 75th anniversary of the independence got our freedom back from this overweening state, which is ineffective, dysfunctional, corrupt, and many other adjectives that one can use. Let's learn from Bangladesh, by the way, a country 50 years old, which was really poor when it was born. It's already beaten us to both in HDI and in this year it will beat us in per capita GDP as well. And probably, given the IPCC warning, it will be the first country in the world which will learn to be amphibious, because there are too many Bangladeshis to go anywhere. India won't let them in. So they'll have to learn to live where they are, and the sea level is going to go up in half of Bangladesh, will be underwater. And if that is so, they'll learn to be amphibious. I think there's a lot to learn from our neighbors. We already learned a lot. We learned microfinance from them. We learned many other things. Let's learn this also.
Mr. Dhawan, if the organizers have conveyed the question to you, I hope you can contribute as well. I'm not sure Mr. Dhawan can hear me. So I would just have to say that what I'm hearing from our participants is, yes, we can, but we are all in this together. We have to create a new model of development, a new model of the economy that's equitable, that continues with high growth, but ensures that that growth permeates to all sections of society. Arguably easier said than done, but for a country that has achieved 75 years of independence and raised per capita incomes from next to nothing to where we are today, I wouldn't say it's impossible. Napina, I think that's my nudge to close the session for now. Over to you. Thank you very much again to our panelists.
Thank you for setting the tone for today's session. Thank you all for making the time to participate in this morning's session. I think the range of perspectives that were covered belies the fact that the session was only an hour long. I'm looking at my notes and I can't believe the wide array of themes that we've been able to cover. To say that it was a masterclass in the most relevant themes of our time would be an understatement. Thank you, Jeanette, for the sharpness and moderation which drew these insights. Thank you all again and wish you a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
To the audience in the auditorium, I want to let you know that we have 40 other sessions over the course of the day. You can go to the reception area and click on the themes you find interesting in order to see the scheduled events. Our next plenary session is at 1 p.m. See you there. Thank you and goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.